Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Austrian Cultural Forum, New York. My name is Melina Tsiamos. I am the Deputy Director of the ACFNY, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. Resting Places, Desecration and Restoration of the Sacred. This panel discussion is a part of the Rooted and Displaced series, connecting Vienna, New York, and Stockbridge, and bringing together psychoanalysts, historians, cultural theorists, and clinicians to explore the meaning of place. I am grateful to our partners, the Freud Foundation US, the Sigmund Freud Museum Vienna, the Erikson Institute of the Austen Riggs Center, for making this program possible. Austria is closely intertwined with the intellectual traditions represented here tonight. From Vienna's history as a center of psychoanalysis and scholarship, to its ongoing efforts to confront memory, loss, and responsibility. It is a particular pleasure for us to host this meaningful conversation among such a distinguished group of speakers. The Reverend Pamela Cooper-White, Professor Suleiman Ali Murad, Professor Diane O'Donoghue, and our moderator, Professor Jane G. Tillman. I thank you very much for joining us and for participating in this event. A few words about the program. After the panel talk, we invite you to join us for a glass of wine at the reception in our gallery space downstairs. And I hope you'll excuse our appearance tonight. We don't always look like this, but we are in between exhibitions. And yeah, I hope the wine and food will make up for it. There will also be an opportunity to see the exhibition we are currently showing on the 11th floor of our building. It's called Documents of Injustice, the Case of Freud. This exhibition was curated by the Sigmund Freud Museum Vienna, and we are very lucky that Dr. Daniela Finzi, who curated this exhibition, is in the audience tonight, all the way from Vienna, and she will give us a tour of the exhibition later. So I wish you an inspiring discussion and an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, welcome. My name is Jane Tillman. I'm a psychologist and a psychoanalyst at the Austen Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Austen Riggs is a private, not-for-profit psychiatric treatment center in the Berkshire Mountains. At the Austen Riggs Center, in addition to my clinical work with patients, I'm the director of the Erikson Institute for Education, Research, and Advocacy. The Erikson Institute builds a bridge between the learning we do in our clinical work with our patients in a psychoanalytic tradition with more urgent sociocultural and historical issues and questions. Again, our roundtable is in collaboration with the Sigmund Freud Museum Vienna, the Freud Foundation USA, the Erikson Institute, and we want to thank the Austrian Cultural Forum for hosting us. For our second roundtable series, we did this a few years ago on a smoky June night from the Canadian wildfires, so we're happy to deal with snow and not smoke this go around. The Erikson Institute explores how play, in the roundtable series, explores how play shapes identity, carries memory, and sustains meaning, particularly under conditions of violence or rupture. In our clinical work at Austen Riggs, we see that human beings require environments, institutions, and missions, both relational and symbolic, in order to contain grief and conflict and to explore human complexity. When such containers are breached, psychic life becomes unsettled and may lose coherence. Repair requires acknowledgement and responsibility, along with a return to a focus on meaning and purpose. Sacred spaces operate at a similar level in communal life. They hold the dead, they preserve collective memory, and they mark what a community considers inviolable. Even in largely secular societies, certain places function as moral anchors, sites that embody continuity, dignity, and shared meaning. Sacred spaces also orient communities toward what they experience as ultimate, whether understood in theological terms as divine presence or covenant, or in secular terms, moral law, historical continuity, or enduring human dignity. In that sense, sacred spaces carry a transcendent function. They point beyond immediate utility or political interest toward values that often exceed the moment. When such places are desecrated, the rupture is not merely physical. It can feel existential. Something foundational about identity, memory, the moral order, or the mission of an institution or society appears to have been violated. Tonight, our presenters will help us think about sacred space as burial grounds, as shared religious geography, and as symbolic container for our collective life. So I'm pleased to welcome our three presenters tonight. The format is, I've asked each person to present for about 15 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes. You'll hear from each person. I'll introduce them before they speak. Then I'm going to ask the three to interact with one another, resonate, whatever you've heard in one another's presentations, and then we're going to open it up and have some discussion with you, which we welcome. So I will start with our first presenter tonight. The Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper White is the Christiane Brooks Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion Emerita and Dean and Vice President Emerita at Union Theological Seminary here in New York City. She has published 11 books, including Old and Dirty Gods, Religion, Anti-Semitism, and the Origins of Psychoanalysis, published by Routledge Press. She's published many voices, Pastoral Psychotherapy in Relational and Theological Perspective by Fortress Press, and Sabina Spielrein and the Beginning of Psychoanalysis, Image, Thought, and Language, also by Routledge Press, published, and the winner of the 2020 Gradiva finalist for Best Edited Book. Her most recent book is The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, How People Are Drawn In and How to Talk Across the Divide, published Fortress Press 2022. This book won the 2022 Indies, or Independent Publishers Association Gold Award for Political and Social Sciences. She was a 2013-14 Fulbright Freud Scholar of Psychoanalysis at the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, and is honorary member of the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis and an academic member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. And she serves on the board of directors of the Freud Foundation US. We're in your good hands.
Thank you, Jane. So the title of my paper is Sacred Space and the Psyche. Buildings speak. Our buildings, including this one, originally were designed by someone to convey a message. And if we don't take time to be still and quietly engage the space, we may miss all that there is in this space to take in through our senses. We may miss not only the messages intended by the original planners, but also all that we and others are bringing to the space, our expectations about what constitutes sacredness, how we should or should not behave here, what parts of ourselves we may allow to come in, and what parts we may try to hide or exclude from view. Our desires for what a holy place might be able to do for us, give us, feed us, heal in us, or strengthen us to go out again and undertake. Like all relationships that engage us at both conscious and unconscious levels, the relationship we have with our sacred spaces is an intersubjective relationship, characterized not so much by what belongs on each side of the relationship, the separate domains of two subjectivities, or in this case, the space and the person, but by the meaning that is co-constructed in the between, in the interplay of the one who gazes and what is gazed upon. Now, I imagine you might object to the idea that because a building is inanimate, this is not really like a human face-to-face encounter. However, because human persons first designed and constructed each sacred building, and through revelation, ritual, remembrance, and recognition, set it apart and named it as sacred, we can perceive, at least dimly, a human attempt to speak to us, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, down through the ages as to persons yet unknown. The older and more actively inhabited the place with others' holy and deeply personal intentions, the more we may perhaps feel that the building speaks to us. Layers of mystery and the lives of other people, their griefs and joys, burdens and sorrows, may come to feel almost palpable in this place as we contemplate the lives that have passed through these walls. How am I defining sacred space? I like the word inviolable that you just said, Jane. Jesuit philosopher and psychoanalytic writer Michel de Certeau made an important contribution to the study of sacred space by distinguishing between place and space. For Certeau, place, lieu, refers to an actual physical location, a fixed point on a map, characterized by stability. A space, espace, by contrast, is dynamic. It encompasses how the place functions and is used by the people who move within it. It is not so much inscribed on a map as described, as Certeau states, by taking a tour, a narrative journey in which the social relations of the space are entwined with its physical features. He writes, "Space is a practiced place." Anthropologists who study space and ritual also now take it as axiomatic that sacred space is always contested space. The Gettysburg battlefield near where I now live, for example, has become a site of both spiritual and commercial pilgrimage because of the harrowing actions that took place there and the multiple layers of cultural meaning invested there by subsequent generations. And also relevant to Gettysburg, place is also, therefore, political. As philosopher Philip Sheldrake has written, we need to become aware of what might be called a longer narrative in which the others who have been made absent by those who control public or institutional histories are now being restored as people who are fully present. And of course, the reverse can also happen, where new negations and authoritarian impulses try to erase others and glorify a monolithic narrative. We can see many examples of this. What sprang to my mind this week was the Trump-Kennedy Center. Such understandings of a site as sacred are never abstract, but always enacted, mediated through the cultural and contextual overlays we inevitably bring to nature and to our understandings of the sacred. In this sense, then, every space can be understood as a text with an excess of meaning that Sheldrake says persistently overflows any attempt at final definition. All this, however, is still only one side of the continuum of relationship, the side the space itself conveys to us when we enter it. We also bring the multiply layered mystery of our own selves, both our outward personalities and our innermost realms of thoughts, feelings, fantasies, sensations, memories, and desires, and our own embodied practices. While we may only initially be aware of the fleeting impressions at a conscious level, whether the place feels friendly or closed off, warm or cold, too bright, too dark, too hard, or too soft, when we first enter an unfamiliar sacred space, we tend to behave like the fairy tale character Goldilocks, wandering into the Bear family's home in search of comfort, sampling their food, trying out all their beds until she found the one just right for a nap. We try out the pews, the chairs in the social hall, the porridge at the soup suppers, to find a place for ourselves within the larger space that seems just right. Often, as visitors, we fail to move beyond this initial stage of testing. We fear the bears that are a hidden part of our own psyches, and we run when we spot a stern, critical bear or a too gushy, potentially invasive or engulfing bear, or a baby bear that might ask too much of us. But if we linger, we may acknowledge that the bears in this place are all pretty much just like ourselves, sniffing the air, testing the cushions, and growling at others occasionally to feel safe. A concept I have found to be helpful from a psychoanalytic viewpoint is D.W. Winnicott's very familiar concept of facilitative space or potential space, and the closely related idea of the transitional object or transitional experience. Sacred space can be understood as both a holding environment in the Winnicottian sense, including specifically as a maternal holding environment or a matrix, a womb. Think of the expression in the Christian tradition, Mother Church, and as a transitional or potential space where imagination, creativity, play, and reality meet. Why specifically maternal? The security of the womb and the relative ease or difficulty, even trauma, as Otto Rank famously said, of our own births, constitute our earliest felt experiences. Regardless of our gender identity now or the gender identity of our primary parents, most of us were formed in a kind of amniotic paradise, although not true for some, and expelled from it through an amniotic rupture. This imprint, whether good or bad, will resonate with every experience we have of both mother and space. For this reason, the interior of a church building holds a certain primal resonance to that first space. Some buildings, by their shape, their lighting, the colors of their furnishings, may be more primally reminiscent of our unconscious first memories than others. For example, the Chartres Cathedral labyrinth that is now being replicated throughout many North American churches. Have any of you seen the Chartres labyrinth or any other labyrinths that are around in various places? It might be seen as a fairly explicit symbol for the spiral of life in and out of the maternal matrix. But in any sacred interior, we are held and contained by design, and this holding recalls our first experience of being held in the womb. Moreover, because this space is specifically set apart as sacred, it functions with a very particular heightened intensity in relation to the inner spaces of our psyches. We are more likely to project onto the sacred whatever we have come to associate with the spiritual, perhaps those aspects of our inner life that we hold most precious, tender, even most core or secret, our most primal needs and desires, and also our earliest dreads and fears. Just as the psyches of mother and infant originally meet and form a unique intermediary space between them, which is internalized in the unconscious life of the infant, and then exists both internally and in the actual relationship with the parent and the environment. Prior experiences of mothering, both by actual parental figures and, if attended, by the church or other religious institution, will enter into the way we now perceive the church we are in, both as place or physical building and as space, the social community it houses. And this interaction will create a unique intersubjective reality between this sacred building, each individual, and the community as a whole. So if we understand our sacred spaces in some sense, then, to be both maternal holding environments, matrices of our ever-growing psyches, and also transitional or potential spaces in which we're invited to play in the realm of me, not me, and maybe for those with religious affiliations, even me, the divine, we should expect to find places of light and shadow, plain meaning and mystery. In short, places of paradox. And when I have written about this for people who are thinking about renovating their sacred spaces, I say that, to have an honest space, you need to have elements of light and dark, plain meaning and mystery. You need paradox, because that is what will resonate with the actual human experience. Winnicott placed a high value on maintaining the creative tension inherent in paradox and ambiguity. This paradox of space that is simultaneously familiar and strange resonates with Freud's discussions of the uncanny, das Unheimlich, the unhomelike, in which the familiar, the homelike, and the unfamiliar are closely intertwined at the level of the psyche. Because the word heimlich can mean both familiar / homelike and private / secret, what is comfortably familiar can also slide over into what is hidden, even mysterious. Conversely, the unheimlich produces an eerie feeling precisely because it involves an encounter with something familiar that has been repressed and then returns unexpectedly in an inexplicable or mysterious way. The frightening, which leads us back to what is known of old and long familiar, Freud says. Freud links this process to several infantile anxieties, but perhaps most related to the idea of sacred space as a womb or matrix, he links the uncanny with the mother's genitals, or her body more generally. He says, this unheimlich place is the entrance to the former Heim of all human beings, to the place where each one of us lived once upon a time and in the beginning. Not everyone, of course, enters into a sacred space to seek an overpowering sense of otherness and mystery. However, the extent to which a sacred space is by definition a practiced space full of paradox and multiple layers of storied meaning, we cannot avoid the otherness that will meet us there, even if we try only to remain attached to what is familiar and known within it. In conclusion, whenever we dwell within our sacred spaces, wherever and whatever they may physically be, and it might be a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a sangha, or even a garden or a special place in nature, we might consider what depth dimension we can discover there. For the potential space that we encounter in the matrix of sacred places is also in us. To quote the French philosopher and author of The Poetics of Space, immensity is within ourselves. We might consider how this space functions for us as a sacred matrix filled with multiple layers of meaning, accessible at both conscious and unconscious levels, the paradoxical relations of inside, outside, familiar, strange, past, present, present, future, and imminent, transcendent. How might such spaces become true potential spaces in which we can discover / create the loving, holding presence of what we experience as sacred, and in which all that we are, light and shadow, known and unknown, familiar and strange, self and other, even Julia Kristever's other within, can be embraced, healed, and empowered. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You've given us a good lead off and something to think about as we move on to the other presentations. Our second presenter tonight is Dr. Suleiman Murad, who teaches at Smith College as the Myra M. Sampson Chair and Professor of Religion and Middle East Studies. His courses focus on history, religious thought, law, and modernity, on comparative topics in monotheistic cultures, including Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and on food as tied to identity, religion, culture, and the environment. His publications include The Mosaic of Islam, published by Verso in 2016, and the Rutledge Handbook on Jerusalem, published by Rutledge in 2019. He enjoys cooking and gardening and is currently spending the spring semester as scholar in residence at the American University of Beirut, finishing a book about Lebanese food cultures and the fading symbiotic relationship of people and nature with recipes of famous regional dishes. Welcome.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Forum for organizing this event, and I want to have a special thanks to all the people who diligently and hardly work to bring us to this space and to have this panel. Thank you so much. I want to share some remarks. I'm not a scholar of psychology, but in the study of religion, we are realizing that emotionality is a very important theme. So part of what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening probably touches on that in some ways. it's not easy to exaggerate the religious importance of a city like Jerusalem and by extension Palestine to Muslims, historically speaking, and to some extent even today. Palestine is equated in the Islamic tradition with the Holy Land, in Arabic al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, and Jerusalem is called Bayt al-Maqdis, originally from the Hebrew Bet HaMiqdash, meaning the sacred house, and out of which the modern name of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, derives. When we speak of Jerusalem as Islamic sacred space, we need to recognize that this resulted from several separate and interconnected processes and impulses. On the one hand, there are foundational elements that predate Islam. They are tied to biblical history, irrespective of whether that history is real or imagined. And also, they are tied to the Judeo-Christian veneration of Jerusalem and, by extension, Palestine. These foundational elements constitute of what we generally call the shared heritage between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. On the other hand, there are peculiar elements that the Muslims themselves developed over the centuries, and they include the legends of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem and ascension to heaven, which, as historians, we date approximately somewhere between the year 617 and 619 of the Common Era, supposedly when the Prophet Muhammad was still in Mecca. There is also the Muslims' use of Jerusalem as direction of prayer for several months. Traditions tell us up to 12 or 14 months in 622 and 623 following the Prophet Muhammad migration to Medina. That is before the Kaaba in Mecca was established as a direction of prayer in Islam. The cities, in this respect, the connection of Muhammad to Jerusalem, or that legend of the night journey to Jerusalem, ties two things. On the one hand, the city's biblical legacy lends legitimacy to Muhammad's endeavor, and his name reaffirms its centrality. So here, the sacred space, there is this negotiation that it lends legitimacy and it receives legitimacy from an act that happened. At the same time, the process of veneration involves other processes that have to do with the tangible, the ritualistic, the symbolic, and the imaginative. Together, they form meanings that we associate, in the case of Jerusalem, with the city as a whole, or with specific spots therein. The process of veneration can even transcend the place altogether. And the best example actually is from the Christian tradition. The idea of Jerusalem above, which actually became so potent and so significant that even it impacted some Jewish and Islamic articulation and perception of Jerusalem as a sacred place. So here it's completely unrelated to the real. This is a different level of sacrality. Also, it's never static, but rather dynamic and fluid in many ways, like Pam just mentioned earlier. Not only because the real is shaped by the idea and the idea reconfigures the real, there is as well our situationality, be it in the moment we live in, our present in general, or our future outlook. These often dictate what we remember from the past and how to remember it. Situationality introduces dynamism and fluidity, thus the idea and reality of a place like Jerusalem constantly grow and change. And to give you an example that illustrates that, David's and Solomon's Jerusalem is not the same as Jesus' Jerusalem. And they both are different from Muhammad's Jerusalem. I mean this in terms of the actual city changing, but also its symbolism, its sacredness, the meaning, are constantly evolving. And if we look at Jerusalem as a sacred place from the perspective of people who live in it, this is different from the people who live outside of it, who only hear about it or try to visualize it from a distance, read about it. And this is applicable today and in the past. We might think that we are talking about the same place, but in many ways we are not. It's necessary, therefore, to acknowledge that the sacredness of Jerusalem has multi-layers. And these are not simple layers like we are looking at usual strata of soil. Rather, we need to think of it as layers that have been hit by an earthquake, that in some parts we can still visibly see the layering, but in other parts it has been so shuffled or turned upside down that we really can't tell how to separate them or which one is first. And in this respect, when we think of Jerusalem, the Christian and the Jewish and the Islamic layers, they have shaped each other. And they belie any simple linear chronology where you would say Judaism first and Christianity second and Islam last. There is a lot in the perception of the sacredness of Jerusalem that really belies all of this. Just to give you, for instance, some simple examples. When the Crusaders came to Jerusalem, they discovered that the Muslims venerate the Temple Mount as a place, one of the venerations that they associate with the place and its sacredness is that this is where Jesus was born. And the Muslims have, from very early on, made a small prayer place. Supposedly they call it Mary, where Mary gave birth to Jesus. In Arabic, it's called Mahd Isa. And adjacent to it, there is Mary's Mihrab. This is a place where Mary sat to pray. Some of that is taken from the Protevangelium of James, but the Protevangelium of James associates this part with when Mary was still in the temple, not when Mary gave birth to Jesus. And obviously, Jesus was born according to the dominant Christian tradition in Bethlehem. But for some reason, the Muslims brought this back to Jerusalem. And when the Franks came, they built a church on those spots. And when the Muslims took Jerusalem again, they discovered that aspect. So here, it's not that the Franks came and said, no, this is lunatic. It's not here. No, now there are two stories about essentially, not that Jerusalem as a place of birth of Jesus became a dominant story in Christianity, but it was accepted by Christians at one point and treated as sacred. So in this way, and you can look at examples of Jewish tradition as well, where certain perception of Christian attitude toward Jerusalem reinforced certain themes in the mind of Jewish scholars to associate with Jerusalem. That you clearly see how this dynamic of sacredness, one borrowing from the other influences and rethinking their own attitude to it. But to go back to my central point, Jerusalem, and this is true of Palestine as well, occupies a significant place in the Muslim religious collective psyche and worldview. And this significance, as I said, there is the biblical element, there is association with the Prophet Muhammad, and over time the Muslims, with their living experience, they added layers that with time became sacred layers. Those sacred layers became objectionable to some Muslim scholars over the years, some Puritanists, so to speak, who would look at them as awkward or as desecration, acts of desecration. For instance, we have a pilgrim in 1140s of the Common Era coming to Jerusalem, Muslim pilgrim, and he's telling us every year around the time of the pilgrimage, supposedly the pilgrimage to Mecca, around 20,000 Muslims come to the Temple Mount to worship and make the pilgrimage there because they can't go to Mecca. You think of it today, you just jump on a plane and you are there within a few hours. But in pre-modern times, this takes weeks, if not more, and it's really arduous journey. And lots of people, local people, who could come to Jerusalem within less than a day would opt actually to make the pilgrimage. What type of experiences people are having and what type of stories they are taking. Some of those, for instance, is that if you go to Jerusalem on 3 different pilgrimages, that equals 1 to Mecca, right? And those kind of stories and legends, other scholars would look at them like, you are replacing the pilgrimage that God instated with pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So on the one hand, we see this kind of fist fight, struggle within the tradition about some groups insisting of certain elements that they consider to be sacred, and if you add them up, they make a bigger aspect or bigger gain, whereas others would look at them as acts of desecration. And this gonna take me to the second point and try to move fast here. Shared sacred sites like Jerusalem can generate peculiar psychological mindsets and behavioral impulses, since they are spaces of interconfessional rivalry. I'm not sure there is a city more contested than Jerusalem. This is true today, and this was true about in the past. Rivalry does not mean violence, though. But for it to turn violent, it needs triggers. And most common types of triggers are acts of desecration, whether they are actual or symbolic, real or imagined. I do not think that desecration is triggered by the physical presence of someone from a different faith. Interestingly, we know a lot that during the Islamic rule over Jerusalem, historical times, anybody could come individually to pray there, whether they are Christians, Jews, or Muslims from any denomination. The problem when it is the control that passes to another rival group, or when the actual site itself is threatened. Those can trigger violence, because as mentioned a little earlier, those are acts that we can label them as acts of trauma. At least they can cause some kind of religious trauma, given how loaded the symbolism of a certain place is. And an example that happened not very recently, it happened in 1991, if I'm not I'm blanking on the date. The late Israeli politician Ariel Sharon, who orchestrated the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Beirut in 1982, he forced his way into the Haram of Jerusalem with bodyguards and supporters. And this act triggered what we call the Second Intifada. There are many causes for Palestinian suffering under Israeli occupation. But in this case, the trigger was fear that Sharon's visit intended to assert Israel control and annexation of the Haram. And parallel to this, 2 years ago, a little more, 2.5 years ago, Hamas unleashed one of the most horrible attacks in modern times against Israeli civilians, October 7, 2023. And they dubbed it the Aqsa deluge, or the Tawafan al-Aqsa in Arabic, which in their mind is justified, right? That's how they justify it, that they are doing this in defense of the Aqsa, of the Haram of Jerusalem, of the sanctuary of Jerusalem. So what we are talking about here is excessive veneration can lead to excessive gullibility, especially if there are political actors ready to exploit the religious feelings and fears of their followers or opponents. So What Sharon did had two intended purposes. On the one hand, to exploit the Israeli religious Jewish side and this kind of anticipation that at one point the temple will be rebuilt. So there is an aspect of exploitation that we have to read into that act. This wasn't an innocent act. It's not an individual person walking into a place to offer some kind of observation, religious observance. It was an act to exploit the religious feeling of their own community. At the same time, Sharon knew that this is so offensive to the Palestinians that it will trigger a very angry reaction that might justify a counter-reaction on the part of, say, Israeli police. The same way, Hamas knows that it can exploit the Palestinians given their attachment to the Aqsa Mosque and conduct something like this that by masquerading it as an act of defending the Aqsa would justify, in the opinion of the leaders of Hamas, that the Palestinians will tolerate something like this. So here we become, our veneration to a place turns us sometimes into exploitable subjects, unfortunately. And I'm going to finish here, and I hope in the question and answer we can talk a little bit more about some of the other points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will now turn to our third presenter, Dr. Diane O'Donoghue, who's the Director of the Program for Public Humanities and Senior Fellow for the Humanities at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. As a scholar, member, and faculty of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, Dr. O'Donoghue chairs their Division of Interdisciplinary Studies and directs the Ecker Fellows Program. An art historian and former department chair at Tufts with a background in archaeology, she became increasingly interested in what was forgotten as part of what was retrieved, and drawn to these issues within psychoanalysis. Her book On Dangerous Ground, Freud's Visual Cultures of the Unconscious, published by Bloomsbury in 2019, was the recipient of the Robert S. Liebert Award and brought some of these threads together. Her current book project considers long-standing interest alongside the question of posthumous harm, an inquiry indebted both to her experiences at the Währinger Jewish Cemetery in Vienna and as a recent visiting fellow at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. And Dr. O'Donoghue has some slides that she'll share with us about a project she's been involved with for years.
Thank you so much to Jane, to Daniela, and to Tom. I will miss your many emails. You have shepherded this event so beautifully and in such a beautiful surroundings. As an art historian, of course, I cannot resist showing you some images. The images are not easy, some of them to see, but some of them are very hopeful, and that's also part of this narrative. There's two nodal points that I want to just say before I give my paper, and they combine Vienna and the Berkshires, Austen Riggs, in very particular ways. I first spoke about this project in the lecture room of Austen Riggs Center as the Erikson Scholar. And it came out of years, starting with being the Sigmund Freud Fellow at the Freud Museum, and to find and develop this project in Vienna. So this truly does bring lots of the people in the room here together. Cemeteries reflect a wide variety of cultural practices, but as established places, their claim to a kind of sanctity, despite a very wide interpretation of this term, is one that I believe is predicated on ideas of trust. The post-mortem is a very vulnerable state. And if the deceased, as in the examples of those I will discuss this evening, wished their bodies to be interred, then they were committed to the ground in the expectation of a final resting place of repose. For over 100 years, from the final decades of the 1700s until the years approaching the 20th century, the Jewish cemetery in the district of Vienna, then called Währing, was a place created to accommodate the prescribed rituals associated with kavod hamet, the honoring of the dead. Families, a maternal ancestor of mine among them, acquired burial plots here that, in documents that have survived, specifies such things as the perpetual care of the gravesite and thus a safeguard to the remains buried below. When it was closed to burials around 1900, as the Jewish population of Vienna had been increasing and a larger cemetery was needed, the Währinger cemetery remained open and verdant. It had been designed following the popular model in Jewish cemeteries of this period in Europe called the Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, with carefully chosen plantings and a main walkway lined with impressive trees, lime trees, in fact, which is very interesting. In 1938, with the annexation of Austria into the Third Reich, Jewish properties of all sorts became subjected to attack and destruction. The Währinger Cemetery was no exception. Its destruction was brutal. But in the first decades of this century, significant repair has occurred thanks to an allyship and support from many quarters, realizing a level of restoration that we, as a small descendants group, could never have achieved alone. So this is an impressive example of reclamation and healing. So this is the art history side. Now I'm going to stand up and just put on a few slides, but I'd like to just be able to see them myself as I show them to you. So all the images that you'll see here are taken over a bit of a considerable period of time. I first came to the cemetery in 2010, and I was last there in the fall of 2024. This is what the cemetery looked like on my first visits there. The cemetery was the final resting place for over 30,000 persons, represented by about 10,000 extant headstones. Some of it was so destroyed that it was as though the ground was reclaiming it. And when I entered on a tour by chance, I came upon this unusually spared gravesite and realized ultimately that this was my ancestor, named, of which my first name, Diane D., comes from him, originally David Rafelovic, and he died in 1877. Those of you that know something about the Jewish practice of giving the name of the ancestor. So I was named for my grandfather. He had been named for this man and this man and this man. So it was quite a remarkable and uncanny thing. When I visited in 2024, this is what it looked like. We restored it. There wasn't so much to do, but because the neighbor, as you see, was in complete and horrific disrepair, my family and I repaired the neighbor as well and learned quite a bit about them. I'll talk in a minute as to why our grave was probably spared. This is what it looks like today. So an impressive example on many levels. But this is not the story that I am going to focus on here. This story is one that several people in this room have heard more than once. But I'm going to tell a different story, one that's inspired by the current work I'm doing, but also by the provocation, the invitation of this panel. But what I'm going to talk about relates directly to the idea of a sacred space, but perhaps in an unexpected way. I will consider here the question of what happens when those interred at a site literally lose their place. For not all those once buried here in Währing remain in the ground. They're gone. Theirs were not those examples of disinterment in the Jewish tradition, perhaps beginning with Joseph's request that his bones be carried from Egypt, or the well-known instance when Herzl's remains, buried in a smaller cemetery not far from Währing, was taken as his will requested and reburied in Israel in 1949. Rather, I'm speaking of those exhumations that would never have been sanctioned by the family or desired by the deceased. These were part of the destruction of the cemetery that extended not only to their graves, but to their actual remains. In death, these individuals were caught in the racialized violence that was swirling around them. And between 1942 and 1943, more than 1,000 graves were disturbed. Those burials were taken away to post-mortem fates that we are now recognizing as part of the repair that is necessary here. These fates were not all the same for all those no longer in place, but they all violate the prohibition elaborated in the Talmudic tradition against the humiliation of human remains. About 200 of the graves were opened, such as this, which was still an opened grave when I took this picture in 2012. The individuals that had been interred here were brought to the laboratory of the anthropologist Josef Vostel, a very early and ardent adherent to Nazi quote-unquote race theory, who spent his career at Vienna's Museum of Natural History. The removals from the Währinger Cemetery were not random. Vostel had a wish list, he called it that, a wish list, of those who were buried there. Many had been buried for over a century, and among them some of the best known and most prominent of the city's early Jewish families. In his laboratory, their skulls and skeletons would be subjected to various forms of handling, from measuring their bones to breaking them, all in the service of creating fallacious metrics of difference that supported spurious claims of a particular danger or contamination. Vostel was considered to be an authority at determining who was Jewish, and thus a direct threat to the Nazi phantasm of racialized purity. His techniques were well known, and he was connected with those who created the infamous Jewish skeleton collection in Strasbourg, mentioned often in the testimonies at Nuremberg, where many people were murdered for their remains. This atrocity was known to Himmler and Eichmann, likely to Hitler himself. It was Vostel who championed, by the late 1930s, the exhuming and comparing of the remains of long deceased Jewish persons. Those taken from the Währinger Cemetery ultimately, after the war, were reburied in a mass grave in the Jewish section of the city's central cemetery, but not before the data taken from them were to become evidence promulgated by Vostel and then many others to justify the murder of untold numbers, including, most likely and certainly most poignantly, some of the deceased's own descendants. For the remaining perhaps 1,000 persons, although they were exhumed in the same years, this was done with no motivation to acquire particular remains. A large corner of the cemetery was appropriated to build a bomb shelter, never realized it was used later in the war as a fire pond. Initially, the Nazi command allowed members of the Jewish community to disinter the coffins themselves. But in the ever smaller and often quite elderly group of people, they could not realize the expectations of such a rapid, forced exhumation. So the vast majority of those in these 4 sections of the cemetery were never reburied. Rather, they were carted away to be used as landfill and construction sites, while others remained piled nearby and are now on the grounds or under the foundation of that apartment building, which now stands beside it. So this was the area that had held the 4 sections that had been dug up. In 1942, one of those exhumed was Jacob Nathanson, Freud's maternal grandfather. This is the same year that 4 of his granddaughters, the sisters whose lives and fates are discussed in the exhibition here, were murdered. These events are deeply intertwined, as the desecration and effacement experienced by those in the cemetery was enacting the genocide that was simultaneous to it. So what occurred for those taken away in death was a form of dispossession and desecration that I felt required a response, that both followed in the spirit of the restoration and repair of the vast numbers of the headstones here, but also required something specific to it. The names of these persons are in the Jewish burial records, so we can return that aspect of their identity. This is crucial as people coming to looking for an ancestor whose name may be in a database, but whose grave no longer exists. For many of us descendants who had the privilege/responsibility of restoring our relatives' burial site, imagining their presence as they would have wished. In the records of my ancestor David, his widow, as he was from Odessa and died while on business in Vienna, made certain decisions on his behalf. He loved Vienna, and he was a great admirer of Germanic poetic culture. It inspired her to bury him here, far from the rest of the family. But the choice was to honor him, as was the selection of the Heine poem, which was inscribed on the horizontal portion of the stone. And in all likelihood, this is what spared it from the destruction of its neighbor. But all these choices were made very much with his interest and wishes in mind. The gravesite reflects in death who the person was when alive. Freud, on writing on death in 1918, observed that in our inability to face this inevitable reality, we take refuge in fiction. Now, it's very interesting that many of those fictionalized mythological accounts become part of the very structures of psychoanalysis, used as proof tests, as it were, for incestuous passions or murderous rages. But in the Vienna cemetery, we're dealing with a different relationship between death and fiction. Those disinterred here became fictionalized, even those whose names appeared on Vastal's wish list. Their remains, and those in the seized sections, were made into characters enacting a vicious, racialized scenario where their mistreatment as remains became part of the murder of living persons. The fictions of contamination, of threat or danger is what defined and defiled these bones, not of lives lived or experiences had or aspirations in life or in death. This fictionalization moves them away from being actual objects and subjects. Those philosophers who have focused on the phenomenology of death would observe that existing as alive and not existing as death are two states which they categorize by the term being, which of course this is a very complicated term, but they use it as being as speaking of someone as is or as was, but the relationship between that is what they call as being. They have noted, for instance, that to say Socrates is dead is not to say there was no entity known as Socrates. But in this way, Socrates is different from, say, Pegasus. A property of fiction is to represent something or someone as extant and existent, who in fact does not or did not exist. And for these individuals who in death were seized and desecrated, part of the posthumous harm was that they were turned into something that they in fact never were. So we are currently, this is summation now, we are currently in the process of imagining a memorial. So I wanted to end on a note of what the cemetery looks like now in parts. This is another restored section. So we are imagining a memorialization for these missing persons, partnering with the various stakeholders who now form such a robust community of those involved in the preservation of the Währinger Cemetery. We share a commitment, all of us, to return these individuals to view, to present their names, especially important for those descended from them, and to recognize that they were exhumed and desecrated. Ethically, it's important to make visible what happened to them in their post-mortem state. It is my hope that such a recognition can bring more healing and repair here, but also that it can serve as an example for others, those working at desecrated Jewish burial sites, but also far beyond that, and in many places globally where attacks on the dead are so frequently a form of a wish to vanquish the living. Suleiman and I were just talking about this, and my fantasy would be that this would extend to Gaza, and this would extend to many African American desecrated sites in this country, that, let alone the 1 million human remains in museums, which also need to be realized as posthumous harm. And hope that there would a wish that those that no longer are where they imagined they would be in a deeply, and for so many of them, sacred place, can be remembered. Thank you.
I think a moment of silence for that.
I said I'm probably going last was a good thing for me.
Yeah. I want to thank all three of you. It's not lost on me that we started with Pam in the womb, and we finished with Diane in the tomb. But both sacred spots that hold us from the beginning of time, the beginning of our being, and posthumously, and in the ground, hopefully eternally, and the great meaning of these places. Our series asks how place shapes identity and holds memory under conditions of rupture. In your view, and I think all three of you spoke to this, what distinguishes a sacred place from a historically significant one? I think there's great overlap, but there's something sacred in what leads to violence, what leads to remembrance, what leads to healing. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about one another's presentations in terms of what makes something sacred.
Well, I actually think you hit on the best word for it in your introduction, inviolable.
Yeah.
Which goes directly to what you were talking about, the violation of that. It's something more than just something we would lament as a wrongdoing, but it was really, just to call it a desecration is to understand the ways in which some kind of covenant between the living and the dead was ruptured there. And I actually also think a tomb is another form of womb in a sense. It's another place that holds, and not by coincidence, lots of churches, especially in the past, had graveyards all around them, and many cathedrals have graves within them. So there is that connection between the living and the dead. And something that happened actually at Salisbury Cathedral, I think it was in the 19th or the 18th century, was that somebody decided that because of the way all of the graves had been sort of put in willy-nilly at whatever spot, and then you'd see the effigy of the person. Somebody decided in the aesthetic of the 18th century that that was untidy. And so they exhumed everybody And if you go into that cathedral, it's very unusual because all of these graves, you know, with the elevated platform and the effigy are now lined up. But the remains were all had to be moved in order to do that. They actually found out some interesting things. My ancestor, it turns out, was poisoned because there was a rat that was dead from the arsenic that poisoned the ancestor, who wanted the hand. He was the husband of a woman who was one of the founders of the cathedral, and he went off to the Crusades. A suitor came and wanted to presume him dead and marry her. She said no, and so at a banquet to welcome his surprise return, the suitor poisoned him. But just the notion that you would, for aesthetic reasons, exhume all of these people and then put them in a row, it strikes me not as horrific as what you're describing, but still a form of desecration for the wrong purposes.
I also think the Ariel Sharon story, the violation of the sacred space of another that is known to be a sacred place, is such a powerful enactment. And you know, this was, of course, very much perpetrated against Jewish cemeteries in Europe, but is still perpetrated against cemeteries of all sorts. It becomes this entry into taking the right to go in to a space. And as you say, not with curiosity, not with an interest to know something, but with an absolute agenda that's based on predications of violence and of, and that was very striking to me when you said that.
But in that question, in a way, it might seem easy, but it's very treacherous. This, the separation, because let's say, classically speaking, what distinguishes a historically significant from a sacred is the association with the metaphysical, with a beyond physical, right? And oftentimes we might say with a divinity. I don't want to say God, divinity, because there are cultures don't have God, but they have a sense of divinity. And we have obviously today we have abstracted that divinity to the extent that has become idea, but traditionally, oftentimes people thought of it as physical. Let's not forget that Jerusalem is called in Hebrew Bet HaMikdash, that is the sacred house of God. And the earliest occurrence was actually the belief that God was somewhere inside, and then it evolves into the God spirit, and then God actually it is the symbolism of God. So we as humans, we abstract that idea to the extent that now God is completely, or the divinity is completely abstracted. But to go back to that point is, in the final analysis, it's us as humans who create meanings that distinguish a place from sacred and a place from being significant, historically significant. And then, when we establish it as sacred, we become almost like custodians, and our failure in the case of, we are custodians of keeping the dead in that place, because there is a point in the future that those dead might have to come back, might have to be assembled, or whatever, right? That failure is a moment of rupture, is a moment of trauma, right? So, and that's why it turns out sometimes to be exploited, because you failed from protecting that. Sometimes there's no utter, like with the Nazis, the Jewish community in Europe had no way to resist that or to object to that. In other parts, people might feel that they have a room to object. And again, today, that in your under your realm in terms of specialization, the rise of what we often call white supremacy or Christian nationalism or whatever, is sometimes predicated on acts of desecration of certain cultural monuments. So here you see how certain actors can exploit those feelings and bring those groups to a position where they might become enablers of horrible acts, to say the least. And here I want to say, to raise a point about distinction between control, that means ownership, and control, that means custodianship.
I like that word, custodian.
Yeah.
And especially for shared sacred space.
Exactly. And their custodianship admits that you are in some way controlling and you call the shots, so to speak. But in the final analysis, custodianship means that you are aware of your responsibilities vis-a-vis that place. And that is exemplified in the case of the sacred, where as a custodian, you feel you are tied. You can do certain things, but there are lots of things you cannot do to that place. And to bring an example, I wanted to mention that, I didn't have time, but in 1187, Saladin captures Jerusalem from the Crusaders. And the first act that he ordered was that the rock has to be cleansed, because the Dome of the Rock was taken over by the Franks and turned into a church. They called it the Temple of God, Templum Domini, which is fascinating because there was no temple there when the Muslims took Jerusalem. And supposedly traditional Christianity has moved the temple to the new temple, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Except that the Franks, there is a temple there, so now there are actually two patriarchs in Jerusalem. Many people think today that Christianity doesn't care about the Temple Mount. No, Christianity cares a lot about the Temple Mount. Anyway, so this is, as a notion of custodian, I have a responsibility toward this place. And here, the act of rivalry is very pronounced. But then, that week, they held a court to decide what to do with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Should we confiscate it? Should we destroy it? And there was a big debate. And a Muslim historian preserved essentially what unfolded in that court. And that is the majority of the people there, many of them were religious jurists, said to Saladin, you cannot do anything to this place. You cannot confiscate it. You don't have the right to touch it. This belongs to the Christians. And Caliph Omar, supposedly in 638, when he came to Jerusalem, we don't know whether that is legend or true, but nevertheless, it became accepted as fact later on. When he came to Jerusalem, he affirmed the Christians' right to this place. And therefore, your duty as a ruler is to affirm the Christians' right to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Saladin had no choice, essentially. So here, essentially, you see how those people played on his sense of duty as custodianship, that you cannot confiscate this place. It's not your decision here, and that limits. Obviously, there were exceptions. A century, little more than a century and a half from Saladin, there was a crazy Muslim ruler in Cairo who ordered the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre. But that, by the way, that ruler, his name is Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah, he perceived himself to be God, right? And therefore, as a God, who would be my competitor, right? So, think of today, for instance, we have,
Yes.
right? Like, who would be my competitor that I have to destroy them? And okay, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a competing God, so it has to go so that people believe that I am the God. Right? I deleted the God, I'm a God. So here is the negotiation of another sense of sacredness taken over. But, yeah. So it's very delicate.
Very.
Very delicate thing about historical.
I have a couple of things to say to the same. You're still on your question, but when I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they also said that because there are 3 Jewish authorities that all share that space, they decided to have a Muslim family hold the keys.
Community, yeah.
Hold the keys, and to this day, from father to son, the custodian has been a Muslim.
Yeah, that's rivalry within the same denomination, among Christians.
So we trusted
you bring an outsider.
Right. I wanted to reflect on the historical significant versus sacred that I think can also be distorted or co-opted, because I'm thinking about the monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield, as well as the graveyard. But the monuments on the battlefield and the whole town of Gettysburg essentially is the battlefield, because it moved. The troops moved all over the place. It's not like a football field in one place, and it's called hallowed ground. And there are people who officially call it hallowed ground and have commercial interests in tours and that sort of thing. And when you see Southern tourists come in, they venerate these monuments of the Southern as the lost cause and the war of Northern aggression. And it was about states' right and not slavery, and it's sacred because it's the lost cause of the Confederacy. And that, to me, that is not a transcendent or sacred agenda, because they're basically still looking back to states' rights to do what? To hold slaves. And so, is it sacred because their ancestors were there? Yes, in part, but it's also sacred because the Civil War in many ways has not ever been concluded in the minds of many people.
Yeah, so a site of loss is not the same as a sacred place.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, right.
But it can be called sacred and commercialized even, when it may not really be legitimately transcendent in any way.
Look, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to open up to the audience for some brief questions. Suzanne. And we'll have a mic that gets passed around.
Thank you very much. I would like to break the ice, not with a question, but with a reflection. I listened very carefully to Professor Cooper's presentation on the value, the maternal value and the embracing value of a sacred space. I was stationed in Paris for many years, and we all know that Notre Dame is a very important place that goes way beyond a place where Catholics celebrate and venerate. When the fire destructed Notre Dame de Paris, I was very much amazed by the huge wave of mourning, of shock all over the world that really went far beyond France or Paris. There are many beautiful cathedrals all over France, but why was this fire so significant, this destruction of this place? And I think it's the name, Notre Dame, the reaction of wishing to help, to reconstruct this cathedral came from all religious communities, and they don't get along so well in the banlieues and with all these tensions, but the Jewish leaders, Muslim leaders, the President of the Republic made it their aim to reconstruct this place as quickly as possible, this unifying place. And I think even the timing is quite significant, because the deadline for the termination of the work to reconstruct it was the Olympic Games, another unifying event. And President Macron made it very clear that the cost did not matter, but this work had to be finished for the Olympic Games. And I think this maternal way, the name already of this church, made this miracle possible, that this church could be very, very nicely reconstructed. Thank you.
Thank you for these rich presentations. I just wanted to add an observation that I think is consistent with all of the presentations, but concerns a sacred space just a few miles from here, the space that came to be known as Ground Zero. That during the months after the collapse of the towers, the personnel from the police department and the fire department were involved in the cleanup and recovery operation. And as people may know from the news stories at the time, major fights broke out between the policemen and the firemen, because the policeman acting at the behest of Giuliani understood this as essentially a toxic waste cleanup project that had to be done efficiently and cleanly and as quickly as possible. The firemen understood it as a sacred space that had to be combed through to recover every scrap of human remains, no matter how long it took. Yeah. And they literally brawled with each other over this several times. The firemen ultimately won, which is why it took 9 months to finish the job. But I think it fit all of the descriptions that you were talking about.
And also, as a contested space, a sacred and contested space, the decision about what would be built again on that space was highly contested and took a very long time for people to come to some kind of a cohesive conclusion. And they had a psychoanalytic advisor actually in the museum to try to help understand what the impact would be for people who, you go down in and then you come back out and you're kind of reliving some of the experiences of the people who were trapped there. And she was working with people on how to help people understand the trauma without necessarily being assaulted by it in visiting there. A lot of layers, just as you described, that aren't linear.
And in some ways here, you can talk about different examples, but in this particular case, here you talk about how nationalism becomes like religion, requiring its own sacred, from the flag to the national anthem to other things, to heroes and whatnot. The religion has its own form of anthem. If each religion has, through prayers or whatnot, has its own flag, so to speak, or symbol, and has its own saints and their days and whatnot. So here you see how a process is very, very much similar, except that classically in a religious lingo, we might not say that this is a sacred spot or sacred moment, but if you are working under this influence of the modern nationalism, then that becomes exactly ground zero as a sacred spot. Those who suffer there will directly associate with it. So this is a great example, actually.
Also, the continuation, because you know probably that the structure itself was then all the final debris was taken to Staten Island, to the Kills Field Memorial. So if you go there now, you see these mounds. It's very quiet, very moving. That is where all the building materials, but of course it's all been touched by all the lives, and even at a microscopic level, very small level.
Yeah, but in some way it goes to the topic, because it has become a burial place in some way, given the number of people that died, and how do you approach it? So there is a process of negotiating. Right.
And that was part of the argument, was that they wanted to bury the building.
Exactly, yeah.
It raises for me this sort of a loose thought, but thinking about the Crusades and relics and bringing back pieces of people from other places to venerate them somewhere far off, and how this is an odd thing to do something so desecrating and then call it sacred. That's always been a mystery to me.
Mark Twain has a great thing he says about it, is you need to call them not pilgrims, but looters.
Looters, yes.
They go to the Holy Land and they loot everything.
Yeah,
human remains, stones, and all of this in the name of bringing the sacred back home. Yeah.
Yes, first, thank you all. Hold on, I wear hearing aids. I have to turn them down so I don't blow out my own ears. I want to thank you all because I've done work over the decades that each of you addresses, and it's got me reconsidering things. So if my question and comment is too long, cut me off. But let me focus just on two dimensions. The question of sacred, you spoke about more in terms of desecration, but there's the very positive side of it that you mentioned in the terms of transcendence. And there was a French writer who I think you mentioned who made a difference between places of worship and places of pilgrimage. And the sacred places usually have the power to attract people. And one of the paradoxes that I noticed, and this is just one little sliver that I'd like you all to give some feedback on, is irrespective of ownership, irrespective of custodianship, irrespective of building and monument, there are places that remain sacred over time, both because something transcendent will happen, but often there's something more mundane behind it, and that's physical healing. So there was a time, maybe a quarter of a century ago, I was documenting places of pilgrimage for heterodox Muslims in the Balkans. And you'd find that one of these places, which were for a time claimed by Sunnis and thereafter by Christians, had been places of Bektashi pilgrimage to sites that beforehand had been Christian places, that beforehand had been Thracian places, and beforehand had been something else. And there were physical characteristics to this, that even though somebody would take over a building or knock somebody else's building down, Hausluck wrote about this in Christianity and Islam under the Sultans. The sacred tree, a height from which you could observe, and flowing water. And as I made my way wending through forgotten places in the Balkans, this struck me. And then some years later in Istanbul, I said, let me sit down with the topographic map of Istanbul, and I can pick the places where there were Bektashi shrines that were earlier and then later associated with Mary, and then again were thrown into Sunni tradition. So strip away the building, strip away everything else, and you've got this idea that if I go someplace, something's going to happen beneficial to me and maybe to the world. The Hajj is a major example of that. So anyway, I'd like a little bit of feedback and consideration of the idea of our traveling to a place, and that place in and of itself having, for good reason or no reason, a sacredness that's passed down. Excuse me for the long question.
It sounds to me a lot like the Celtic tradition of the thin place, where there are places that have been recognized. Maybe people believe they have certain energies around them that are healing. Sometimes it's a well, sometimes it's a tor, which can have actually bones underneath in it. Yeah, I mean, it's all over the world, this pattern. Layers that, and pilgrimages develop because people are drawn to those places regardless of the doctrine that might be present in the moment.
So we are at our ending boundary. This came to an end very quickly. It's 8 o'clock. I believe there is a reception. And can you tell us?